Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to the SP Consist build. In this series, I'm working to reproduce HO scale models of 5 locomotives I saw in Truckee, California in 1993. In the last episode, I reassembled my Conrail SD40 number 6283 and got it running. The model is now ready for some final details and weathering. My goals for this time are to apply preliminary weathering, install couplers and all remaining details, and apply final weathering. Unfortunately, back when I took photos of Conrail 6283 in Truckee, I didn't understand that higher speed film would be grainy. I also didn't go across the tracks and take a picture from the sunny side of the train. As a result, my photos are not as good as they could be. Still, having a photo is better than not having one. When possible, I like to rely more on photos than boilerplate formulas for weathering. I think it makes for more realistic results and helps to keep every piece of equipment from looking the same. Since this was a westbound train, at the time of the photo it hadn't yet gone through the snow sheds on Donner Pass. It's possible that shortly after this photo the engine would have been even dirtier. When it comes to weathering though, I'm a firm believer in less is more. It's easy to overdo it. You can always add more weathering. It's harder to take it off, and after spending so much time and effort on this model, I don't want to ruin it with a bad weathering job. I'm going to stick with trying to make the model look like the photo. In this photo, the engine is moderately dusty and grimy. The areas under the grills and the sides of the long hood are dirtier than the area under the dynamic brake fans. It's hard to tell because it's shadowed, but the roof area looks grimy as well. This model has some very light weathering left over from the first time I built it. Also, during the build, I weathered the wheel faces. Since some areas are easier to access before applying the rest of the details, especially the handrails, I want to do some of the weathering first. I'm going to start by using a small microbrush to highlight the door seams on the long hood with some black weathering powder. I dip the microbrush into the powder, then tap it so most of it falls off. I'm using it lightly on the model. The effect should be subtle. I want the seams to look a little grimy, not like a tagger outlined the doors with black spray paint. The same technique also works well on the battery box doors. When I'm done, I'll use a large soft brush to blend the powder a bit more. For the next couple of steps, I'll be using a bigger brush. This one has fairly stiff bristles. I'm using a piece of scrap cardboard as a mask while I apply some more of the same black weathering powder. This will help to keep the powder on the grills. You could also use masking tape, but I don't like to put any kind of tape on a finished model, as I've had trouble in the past with it pulling off the decals. If there's any excess powder, don't rub it, as that will make it stick. I'm using some canned air to blow it off. With the grills and door seams darkened, the model already looks a lot more like the photo. For the next part, I'm using the same brush with very little powder on it. I dip it, then brush it off on some cardboard until there's very little color coming off. Then I'll run the brush over the spots in the model that are a little darker in the photo. Using the soft blender brush helps to make the effect more subtle. The area under the radiator grills is a little darker in the photo too. This is looking pretty good to me so far. I think I'll quit while I'm ahead on the long hood. I found a photo of the other side of 6283 in 1993 online. I'm going to weather that side more or less the same way. Powders tend to make the edges of things darker, so I need to be careful around the blower bulge. I don't want to make the bulge look like it's outlined in black. Looking at my photo, I saw that the straps on the cab signal box are a little grimy, so I'll hit them with a little black powder. I can't tell from my photo what 6283's walkways look like, but the Donner area has a good amount of fine light-colored dirt. I'm using some tan weathering powder and a cardboard mask to put some on the walkways. Oops, that looks like too much to me. I'll use my can of compressed air to blow some away. Then I'll hit the rest with my blender brush. That looks better. In tight areas, sometimes I just need to be really careful with the brush. This is looking pretty good to me so far. The weathering in places that will be hard to access once the handrails are on is now done. Time to add the remaining details. A locomotive isn't very useful without couplers, so I'll start with those. I've given 2 couplers a very thin spray of dark brown acrylic paint with my airbrush. I've mixed the paint thin, almost like a wash. The idea is just to give a hint of color and provide a base for additional weathering. The coupler on the left is a KD156 long shank coupler for the front of the engine. The rear coupler is a KD158. I use long shank couplers on the front end of locomotives with snowplows, otherwise sometimes the trip pin from whatever the engine is coupled to will contact the plow and uncouple. I wouldn't need to use a long coupler if I got rid of all my trip pins, but I'm not ready to do that yet. After giving the couplers a chance to dry, I'll dip them into some dark rust-colored weathering powder. I'll blow off the excess, then wipe them with the soft blender brush. I'll put some black powder on the trip pins. In order to fit into the modified Cotton pilots on the model, I'll need to file the lip off the front edge of the KD draft gear boxes. Now I can assemble the couplers. Before putting them on the model, I want to make sure that they swing freely. To get them to fit through the hole in the pilot, I'll need to file the bottom of the pilot opening slightly. I'll also file down the coupler box. You might recall from very early in this series that I moved the mounting screw locations on my Cotton models. Because of that, I'll also need to shorten the rear of the draft gear box. Thankfully, with whisker couplers, there's a lot of extra room at the back of the draft gear box that's not needed. The shortened box leaves enough room for the truck to swing side to side. I'll secure the couplers with some 256 screws. If you've watched my product reviews, you know what's coming next. Let's check the coupler height. The front looks good. The rear is good too. For me, putting couplers on a locomotive lets me know I'm in the home stretch and the model is almost finished. There's still a bit more work to do though. A couple detail parts came loose while I was handling the engine during the rebuild process. I want to reattach those items. This is the rear-mounted brake wheel and stand. Before I glue it back on, I'm going to grime it up a little. I'm using my micro brush with whatever black weathering powder was left in it from before. I didn't redip it in the container. At this point, I don't want to risk messing up the finish on the model, so I'm going to use canopy glue for this part. I'll squeeze a drop of canopy glue onto some scrap plastic. Then I'll dip the brake wheel stand in it. It took a couple of tries for me to get it back into position. I ended up putting a dab on the back of the stand near the top as well to help hold it. The canopy glue will dry clear, so the white color will go away. This tiny part is a moisture ejector for the air reservoir. It also fell off while I was working on the model. I'll put a small drop of CA on the mounting stem. Then I'll carefully insert it back into the hole that I drilled when I installed it the first time. Now it's back in position. With that part in place, it looks like I've repaired all the damage. Next, I want to install all the remaining details. If you've been watching the series from the beginning, you might remember these project boxes that I got for each of the locomotives in the build. 6283's box has the custom-built handrails that I removed to work on the engine, as well as Cannon fan grills. It's time to put these parts on the model. The handrails are made from brass wire and precision scale stanchions. I'll be covering how to create these in a future episode. I'll need some for the two SP SD45Rs. The handrails will mostly stay on by themselves, but I'm going to use some canopy glue just to make sure. I'll use a toothpick to put a dab of canopy glue on the mounting pins. Then I'll carefully insert the handrails into one hole at a time. When I'm done, I'll press on each stanchion to make sure that it's seated. Canopy glue is water-based, so if there's any excess, a wet microbrush will take care of it. The handrails should be straight when sighting down the length of the model. Thankfully, brass bends pretty easily, so it's not hard to make adjustments. These look good. It's hard to see, but the upper fan rings have 6 small nubs on them that fit over the lower fan ring. One nub should be in the middle facing forward. One is in the back and each side has 2. Also pay attention to how the grill spokes are oriented. Sometimes they varied from fan to fan on the same engine. When installing them on the model, it's important to make sure the fan seats properly. There shouldn't be any gap between the rings. Since I don't have any roof shots of 6283, I'm going to add some visual interest by orienting the dynamic brake fans slightly differently. The rear one has a spoke going front to back. The front one has a spoke going side to side. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'll glue the fans with some liquid styrene cement. I'll brush a little on the outside right over the paint. The trick here is to work fast. Don't go over the same area twice in a row. If something needs to be re-glued, wait a few minutes before trying again. Also, wait a while before touching the area where the glue is applied. The radiator fans installed the same way. Last, I want to install some new parts. Looking at my photo and others, I can see that 6283 had wind deflectors in the 1990s. I have 2 types in my detail parts stash. Detail Associates makes some in clear plastic. These have to be masked and painted. Details West makes some that are photo-etched metal. These have no window glazing, but they also don't need masking. I'm going to go with the Details West parts. Details West Part 357 has wind deflectors with a mirror at the bottom. 6283 had these toward the front of the cab. Details West Part 354 has plain wind deflectors. 6283 had these toward the back of the cab. I'll cut the parts using an old hobby knife blade on a plate glass cutting surface. In my photos, the deflectors are turned flat against the cab side, so I'm going to pre-bend the mounting pins using a file and a pair of pliers. These are the parts after taking them out to the paint booth for a quick airbrushing with the last of my polyscale Conrail blue. There's maybe just enough left in the bottle for a few touch-ups. After thinking about it, I decided not to drill the mounting holes for the deflectors. If I dislodge the windows or any other parts while drilling, it will be a major pain to fix. That's worse than risking having a tiny part fall off at some point in the future. I'm just going to cut the mounting pins and glue the parts to the sides of the cab. Once again, I've used canopy glue to attach the parts. Now I'll add the air filter assemblies that I put together a couple episodes ago. I've used some CA to glue them under the sill. I had to file the smaller one some to get it to fit. The last thing I need to add is a speed recorder. This is Detail Associates Part 2808. It says GE type, but I've seen these on many EMD locomotives as well. There are 4 of them per package, and it looks like I've already used one. The speed recorder has 2 parts. The round flange mounts on the end of an axle, and the square part mounts to the first piece and connects to a cable. Photos I've found show that the speed recorder on 6283 was on the center axle of the fireman's side front truck. The instructions say to drill a 1/16 hole in the center of the axle journal. I'll secure the round flange with CA. I've applied the glue to the part, not down the hole. I don't want to get any glue on the axle ends. The square part has 2 prongs on it. These can be used to connect to very small flexible tubing, like small gauge wire insulation with the wire removed to make a cable. I like to use a different method though. I've snipped off the prongs and used a number 78 bit to drill through the top of the part. Now I'll glue the speed recorder to the flange. I've bent a piece of 010 brass wire to represent the speed recorder cable. I'll glue it into the hole I drilled in the speed recorder into the top of the truck. It really should run up into the locomotive, but I don't want the detail to interfere with the operation of the model. With the speed recorder cable mounted, the truck can still swing freely. And that's it. There aren't any parts left to put on this model. Before I do anything else, I'm going to take a small brush and paint the speed recorder I just installed flat black. While I'm at it, I'm going to paint the brake lines since they're a little shiny. The air filters also need some touch-up. Now the model is ready for final weathering. This is my first piece of HO scale track that I ever bought. It's brass, so it's not great for a layout, but it's good for weathering locomotives. I've put a block of wood behind the engine to keep it still. I'll run it while airbrushing some very diluted earth color paint on the trucks. Keeping the wheels spinning will make sure that the airbrush doesn't make patterns on the wheels, since the side frames block parts of the wheel faces. It's really important to go slow and not overdo this step. Back on the workbench, the trucks look good, just slightly dusty. I'll use some black powder on a microbrush to vary the side frame color a little in spots. For the next step, I'm using some very light, almost white weathering powder. In my photos, the journal ends on the engineer's side front truck are lighter in color. The photo also shows that the front of the fuel tank is a little lighter in color. I'll use some of the same pale powder. This looks a little too light to me, so I'll go back over it with some black. Looking at photos, I noticed that some of the grab irons in the front of 6283 were painted white. I'll get them with a brush. I like to add some depth to the horn castings by putting some black weathering powder inside the bells. The new fans on the engine look too clean. I'll get them with some black powder. I'm going for a more subtle effect on the radiator fans. I found some roof shots of other Conrail SD40s, and it looks like the dynamic brake fans are more heavily weathered. I want a really subtle effect on the roof. My photo shows just a little discoloration on the top of the cab. I'm just using whatever residual color is in the brush without dipping it again. I'll use a little of the black powder on the sill in areas too, again following photos. You might have noticed that I've used mostly black on this engine, but that's what looks most like the photos that I have. The cardboard masking technique that I used on the large grills also works on the small one on top of the inertial filter hatch. The turbo exhaust doesn't have a lot of depth, so I'm going to mix a wash using some flat black acrylic paint and Windex. I'll brush it into the opening, being careful to keep it off the rest of the model. If the wash is too light, more paint from the bottle can be brushed over it while it's still wet. I knew I kept my old hairdryer for a reason. Even though I use flat black, the wash has a slight sheen. After the paint is dry, I'll use a little black powder to make it dull. Now the exhaust stack looks much better. I'll use some silver paint for the small mirrors at the bottom of the front wind deflectors. And that's it. I think I'm going to call this one done as far as the modeling part goes. Now I can repurpose my project box for another model. Basing a weathering job on photos will give the most realistic results. Hobby magazines sometimes try to present formulaic approaches to weathering, and that's okay to a point, but over-reliance on those techniques can lead to a fleet that looks too uniform. Sometimes I find it hard to get through the last 5% or so of a build. By then my enthusiasm for the project has waned, and it seems like there's always one more detail to take care of. It's worth pushing through it though and getting the project done. It's really easy to overdo weathering. Personally, I'd rather err on the side of having a little less than the prototype than too much. You can always add more later. For me at least, a subtle weathering job looks better and more realistic than a heavy-handed one. I wanted my model of Conrail 6283 to look like a hard-working locomotive, not something ready for the scrapyard. I'm really happy with the way 6283 is turning out. I'm not quite done with it yet though. In the next episode, I'll program the decoder and get the engine ready for operation. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.